Hello and welcome to Retech, and this is part 2 of the Commodore Amiga History series that we're doing. And part 1 was very interesting because we got a lot of responses, which I did a kind of a minor video to reply to those, and it was great because this is what it's all about. It's all about interacting with each other. And today we're going to look at the Amiga in a very different way. If you really want to see a kind of a docu-soap type episode, a really good one, then have a look at Nostalgia Nerd's Amiga video that he put together, and it is very good. But this is going down a very different route. This is going down the route of what actually happened, what caused the Amiga to do what it did, and what events led up to things like the operating systems, etc. So today we're going to look at it from a different angle. Now, the Commodore Amiga, it was way ahead of its time in what it was doing in the form of multimedia and sound and graphics, and it actually really did a fantastic job with that, and it was aimed primarily at the business market originally. Now, the founders, or the designers and the founders, were Jay Miner and Larry Kaplan. Now, Jay Miner used to work for Atari, and his speciality was designing custom chips like the ones that were used in the Amiga, and he really wanted to move on from the 8-bit line.
Atari brings the computer age home.
Okay, Ma, what's the capital of Nebraska? Come on. I'm trying.
Learn geography or get your jump shot on target. With Atari home computers, anything's possible. In fact, they just might be the wisest investment you'll ever make.
Watch this. Hey, Mom. What's the capital of Delaware?
Dover.
I told you she's smart.
Atari home computers. We brought the computer age home.
And basically break into the 68,000 processor line. And at the time, Atari really didn't want to do that. You see, Nolan Bushnell had left, and the new owners really wanted to wring as much life out of the 8-bit platform as possible, and all they were really interested in was the 6502 line. So, because of that, he left, and he didn't go back into the industry for a little while. Now, eventually Larry Kaplan asked him to join with him in creating a new model such as the Amiga, and it was a company called High Toro. Now, it was a kind of a startup. It was funded by dentists, and it was initially to build what would be high-end games consoles, and the Amiga was virtually hidden from that fact. See, originally it was to get the consoles out there as games machines, and then eventually to produce a computer if that was successful. But you know, they had different ideas really. You know, Jay really wanted a computer, not a games console. Now, the company itself was kind of plodding along, doing, you know, little bits and pieces for the games market, as well as trying to put together a computer system, a revolutionary one at that. But it wasn't particularly good at getting the funding. They had funding from the original backers, but you know, they were kind of running out of money. And there's a big almost urban legend about how the Commodore Amiga became the Commodore Amiga, or the Amiga from Commodore instead of from Atari, because prior to this Jack Tramiel was with Commodore, and due to a bust up with Irving Gold at the time, he left Commodore. Now, there's a bit of a backstory on this. You see, most people say that they don't know what the argument was for, and Bill Hurd said that Jack Tramiel was not frightened or never wrong-footed by anybody. But on this occasion, this bust-up was big enough and large enough for Jack Tramiel to throw in the towel. And nobody really knew the biggest reason for that. So, it kind of remained a bit of a mystery for a while, and Jack Tramiel went on basically a world cruise after that, to try and get some time back and decide what he wanted to do. Now, this is all part of the history of Commodore Amiga.
The next day, he had a meeting with Irving Gould, and Irving was using company assets like they were his own.
Like the jet?
Like the jet. And Dad didn't like that, and said that was wrong, and said, "You can't do that while I'm president." And Irving said, "Goodbye." So he left, went back to his room, got my mom, they packed and hopped in the car and drove up.
So Jack Tramiel, according to David Pleasance, who was seen as not a friend, but regarded quite highly by Irving Gould at the time, the bust-up was about Jack wanting to get his sons and family members on the board.
And then they tried rumors on us, like saying, well, we just hit $1 billion, but we felt he couldn't take us to $10 billion. And we went, what? No, he grew it to this. So they would try different things. One was that they wouldn't promote you to be a vice president. That was one of the rumors they tried on us.
Yeah, well, given that I didn't actually work for Commodore at the time, that was
management, was just...
the rumor, the story I heard many times was that Dad wanted his sons to run the company,
right.
And we were obviously incompetent, so we couldn't do that, so they had to get rid of him.
And, that didn't sit well, and that's what the bust-up was all about. And if you think about it, the Atari board was basically the Tramiel family, so I'm guessing there was a bit of grain of truth in that, but it all kind of leads to how this computer was eventually built and owned and operated by Commodore. You see, now Jack had left the building, so to speak. Really the only option that they had to get these machines built was to approach a company like Atari, which they did. And it wasn't originally through a direct approach. You see, they took the original Amiga to the CES show, and it was basically in its breadboard build, basically wire wrap and breadboard. And as you can see from here, there was quite a few breadboards and wire wraps to make this machine work. And they really didn't garner that much interest from backers, even though it was a revolutionary machine. And I would have kind of thought that somebody seeing the bouncing ball or some of the stuff that this machine could actually do on display, then it would have got a lot more backers than it actually did. Now, according to the MD of Commodore UK at the time, David Pleasance, he had a kind of suspicion or a reason why they didn't originally get the backers, because at that time, after the computer games and computer crash, the bottom kind of fell out of the market, so to speak, and there wasn't a willing investment channel for things like a new computer, especially as the PC and the IBM PC and clones had got such a footing in the market. Now, that didn't mean that it was a bad machine, because it wasn't, and it didn't mean that it wasn't groundbreaking, because it was. But you got to see it from the point of view of somebody wanting to put money into something. The whole ecosystem in the US had just crumbled. Why would you really want to start putting money into that? So Atari came along and saw the machine and kind of thought, well, we can use some of the tech and we can use it to our own advantage on games consoles, etc., which is basically where they were heading. So really they knew that Hightower was running out of money. So they offered them a deal, and the deal was $500,000 for the next month. If you don't do anything with it or repay it within that time period, then we literally take your technology, the whole lot, lock, stock and barrel. Now, that was a bit of a harsh deal, but, you know, they didn't have any choice, and Atari knew that. So, within that timescale, along comes Jack Trammell, and he's looking for something to do, and he buys Atari for its distribution, because at the time Atari were losing millions of dollars. They were literally bleeding money. So Jack really wanted that side of it for its distribution for Trammell technology, for a machine that he was going to be working on at the time. Now, there's a bit of a rumour that when Jack decided to build a revolutionary new machine for himself, he took a lot of the ex-Commodore employees with him, and that's what he did. And he actually took a lot of their designers across to his new Atari corporation, because he fired just about everybody from that corporation when he took it over, and installed his own people and kept the people he wanted to keep. And that kind of got Commodore and Atari into a bit of a war, because Atari had taken a lot of Commodore employees, and Commodore were saying that Atari was stealing their designs and their secrets, etc. So, you know, there possibly was a little bit in that, but, you know, who knows at the time.
Plus, when some of the engineers got there that had just left Commodore, they arrived to have their trailers padlocked by the FBI. Doug Wren.
Yeah.
Who made the Wall Street Journal front page? Good for Doug.
Yeah, there was a monstrous pissing match.
It was.
Between Commodore and Amiga and Atari and all sorts of stuff, with lawsuits going back and forth.
They admitted they had stuck stuff in the, taken the whole design of the Z80 and stuffed it in the shredder before leaving, and then took the mag tapes with them. They admitted that part. So that's what was started on.
It was bizarre.
So there might have been some reality under the accusations, but again, you know, that's kind of what happens in business, unfortunately. So when Jack found out that Atari had this deal with Hightower about the Amiga and its platform and its technology, he was a little late to the party, because Commodore stepped in and said they would take over Hightower literally again in its entirety, and as part of that deal, you know, they would pay Atari back its money, and that was the premise that we've all been kind of working on. Now, again, there's a slightly different look at it from the likes of David Pleasance. He seems to think that basically Atari were given back the check for $500,000, and it was never cashed, and apparently it's still out there somewhere in its uncashed form. So, whichever side that you believe, whether it was this side or David Pleasant's side, that, you know, the check was handed back and that was the end of it as far as Commodore were concerned. But Jack Trammell really didn't like that, and Atari went to court, and all it really did was delay things for Commodore to get the Amiga out, while it gave Jack time to produce his ST. And they actually got there a fraction early. They got a few months early into the market, their Atari ST. So as strategies go, you can't knock Jack Trammell for that kind of strategy if you were in his shoes. So yeah, it wasn't a bad strategy really. It may have been a bit of, I'm going to pay you back for what you've done in taking our technology from me. But again, it's kind of one of the other sayings in business. Business is war. So, you know, these things happen. Now, the birth of the Amiga was quite a tough one, and it needed a lot of custom chips. Now, the custom chip side of it were kind of produced in-house, a lot of them, but there was one standout feature on the Amiga, and that was its sound. You see, why I say this is a standout feature is because it was the feature that kind of helped this to be a true multimedia machine. Now, you've got to remember that the Atari ST was almost as capable, and it kind of gained its foothold in other areas where the Commodore Amiga didn't. It was lower cost for a start, it was cheaper, it was probably cheaper to manufacture. It was also more compatible with things like the Apple Macintosh, especially using the hardware emulator you could get for it. And also it had built in its niche with MIDI and also desktop publishing, as did the Apple Mac. But again, the ST was a very capable machine, but it wasn't the multimedia machine that the Amiga became, and a big part of that was its sound. Now, the previous Commodore machine, like the 64, was well known for its SID chip, its sound capability. It was just blew the roof off of everything that had gone before it in terms of pure raw sound. Now, the Amiga did very much the same. Now, the Amiga was stereo, left and right channels, 2 voices each, but you could actually split those voices up to get a total of 8 as well, and that's what Optimed used to do, or still does. And it was a very, very capable sound machine, very good for its time, even very good for now. If you hear some of the demos and music demos that these machines can do. You know, you wouldn't think this is a machine that was really kind of sketched together in the very early 1980s. Now, the sound chip was designed by Glenn Keller. It was called Paula, and this whole machine, including its revolutionary sound, was originally called Lorraine. That was the prototype. Now, Lorraine had a few very good tricks up its sleeve, especially where the sound was concerned, because at the time when most people showed off their machines at tech shows, at consumer exhibitions and so on, it was kind of a little bit of a parlor trick by adding in a MIDI system underneath to make it sound much better than it was. Now, this didn't really have to happen with the Amiga because the sound quality was absolutely spot on. But we all know, everybody who's used an Amiga knows what the sound is like. Now, Glenn Keller did a fantastic job with this, and he was not on his first trip into electronics. Now, you see, Glenn Keller worked with a Mr. Salter, and they worked together on an electric power generator in form of a wave machine way back in the mid to late 1970s, and it was featured on programs such as Tomorrow's World, and you can actually see Glenn Keller doing the electronics at the time to make that wave power electricity generator work. So he wasn't new to electronics, and that was through the University of Edinburgh at the time. Now, the standout feature was definitely the sound capabilities of this. Okay, so history-wise, the Amiga had amazing sound. History-wise, the Amiga was almost an Atari computer. And history of this machine was virtually a games machine to start off with, which was quite apt because its best-selling models were the models aimed at the home and game market, such as the Amiga 500. Now, the underlying operating system was Trip OS, written by Dr. Martin Richards as far back as 1976, and it was written at the University of Cambridge, and it was basically a multitasking, multi-threading operating system, which was the basis of what ended up in your Commodore Amiga. And Trip OS is also used widely today, and it is mainly used in the financial and insurance institutions, and it was updated back in 2020. So really, it's still a fairly well-used and current system that survived since 1976, and that formed the basis of the backbone for the Amiga. So the underlying software on the Amiga, the operating system, was a very robust system, but although they cut a few corners in getting it rushed out, for example, memory handling and error checking wasn't the best on these machines.
It would go out and it'd say, give me some memory, and it would never check to see if it got it. It just assumed it got it.
Which is why a lot of people were quite familiar with the guru meditation error that these machines kind of suffered from at the time. Now, these machines were very good for the time, as I've said previously, but David Pleasance, I think, kind of hit the nail on the head. These were being marketed originally as professional, business-like machines. So they had a professional and business-like price tag. And that really didn't help matters as far as sales and volume of sales were concerned. But also, it really didn't find a niche. Really, it was very, very difficult to pigeonhole this machine. It was technically very good, but it was very hard to place the machine at the time. I mean, it was streets ahead of most of the things that were out there. But the Amiga's marketplace did change, and it wasn't through Commodore, it was in spite of Commodore, because the machine started to get a big foothold. Now, Mr. Rattigan, who at the time was the head of Commodore in the United States, decided to kind of split the line up into business and home use, hence the Amiga 500 and hence the more professional big box versions. And that started to improve sales a little bit, and it was starting to structure the machine as a kind of cohesive, coherent unit. So the Amiga 500 was meant to take the place of their Commodore 64 line, really, because the Commodore 64 line had been out for some time, and this was their new flagship machine, the Commodore Amiga 500. But the larger machines were meant to find their way into business sectors, but unfortunately Mr. Rattigan kind of got the boot fairly early on, really before he had time to finish what he'd started. And to be honest, it was working because Commodore was starting to get back into the black and make some money. But the powers that be at the time, Irving Gould, really kind of mustn't have seen eye to eye with Mr. Rattigan, and decided he wasn't handling himself in the manner that he wanted him to. So they got the push because of it. But you know, that's history, and that all forms part of how the Amiga kind of ebbed and flowed throughout its history in the computer marketplace. So So far, the Amiga was initially designed as a breakaway machine because of somebody's disgruntlement with Atari at the time, because Jay wanted to produce this exact machine, or a machine very similar to this. It was originally going to be a games console. It was originally going to be owned by Atari, but that never happened after the change of hands of Atari, and also Commodore's involvement on returning their investment or returning their check, depending on which view you kind of settle on. It wasn't a big hit as far as investment at CES when it was first launched in its breadboard wire wrap form, even though the public thought it was a fantastic machine, and it was doing things that at the time computers really couldn't do. So it didn't succeed in gaining investment. Commodore took it on, and Atari lost out, or Jack Tramiel's Atari lost out. And now the influential people, apart from Jay, were Glenn Keller for the sound chip and the designer and writer of Trip OS, which was the fundamental backbone of this machine. Now, the graphics capabilities were very good, but without the underlying OS and the underlying very good sound on this machine, it wouldn't have become the multimedia powerhouse that it actually eventually became, because you could get very similar games and products and programs on an Atari ST or a PC, and the standout feature was the sound. So this is kind of my take on what makes these machines very special, and what really gets missed out when you look at the history of the Amiga. So I hope you enjoyed this very different take on the Commodore Amiga, and I hope you join me for the next part, and we'll cover a little bit more of the more well-known features and the more well-known aspects of how the Amiga was developed. So for now, I hope this has filled in some of the blanks and the gaps from the other articles and documentation that you may have read about these. Now, whether, it depends on which version that you like the best on the return check to Atari, whether it's David Pleasant's version from kind of being inside the corporation at the time, or it's the version from the engineers at the time, and their take on what happened as well. So again, food for thought, but basically the Amiga became a staple of many of our childhoods and also many of our small businesses. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope to see you soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.